Hi, Dave.
Hit it. Oh,
We did hit it.
we did hit it. Hi, Annika.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you.
Well, it's
Yeah.
not actually Christmas yet,
Not
but
yet,
that's
but
what we're
it's
going to
going to
talk
be
about today,
wrapping up Advent.
wrapping up Advent. So here we are. It's Christmas. What we have been waiting for has actually arrived. The baby has been born. The promise has been fulfilled.
Woohoo!
But seriously, we've talked about quite a few things during all these Advent episodes. We've talked about how maybe in today's day and age, we've domesticated this crazy, bizarre, wonderful story. We've talked about how Advent is just a part of this great bigger story. In fact, it's just a little episode in what God has been up to and what he continues to be up to in our real everyday lives. We've talked about how Advent is like other great epic stories, and actually, other great epic stories are like Advent, and they have these themes like
Yeah.
life and death, like good and evil, like hope and despair. But the best one, I think, and one that we've really landed on is just how all these stories have ordinary people in them. And the ordinary people even become the heroes. People like
hmm
Frodo and Sam, Luke Skywalker, and we talked about Sally and Edmund last time. And really, now we're talking about, well, we have talked about Mary and Joseph. I
Fits
mean,
the
they're,
stereotype. Yep.
yeah, that
hmm
same, it follows these same patterns. Actually, it sets up these same patterns. And so that's where we're going to land today. Ordinary. These
hmm
ordinary people. Um, and we're going to talk about how it's not just these ordinary characters, but God took it a step further, blew everyone away. If you're really paying attention, God has actually become ordinary. So let's start there. What does that mean? I can hardly
hmm
wait.
Well, let me set the context a little bit. It's kind of set up by the fact that, honestly, I remember as a kid, particularly around Christmas, often imagining how incredible it would have been to have been there when it happened, when the
Right.
baby was born, when the Word became flesh. Um, and what I kept thinking as a kid was how much easier it would have been to believe if I could have seen it, if we would have been there, that it would be easier to believe that he actually was, and easier to believe that he was who he said he was. To be able to say, "There he is, there's God right over there." To be able to say, like John, the writer of the Gospel, John, he's an eyewitness, and so when he starts his Gospel, John, he says, "These are what I'm about to share with you are the things we've seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and handled with our hands concerning the word of life." And because when the word became flesh, John also said this in John 1, verse 14, when the word became flesh and dwelt among us, we beheld his glory, which means
Hmm.
they saw the glory. They got to see, because now all of a sudden God has a face and a name and an address and a voice. And if I saw the face of God, if I could see, how much easier it would be to believe, right?
Hmm.
But as it turns out, in the actual story, we may think it would be easier to believe, but as it turns out, not everyone saw glory. Words became flesh, dwelt among us, we beheld his glory, but not everybody who looked at Jesus saw glory. Some people just saw a baby because he was a baby.
Hmm.
That's why they saw that. Others saw more than a baby, even at the beginning. The Magi, remember, they saw
Yeah.
more than a baby. Something more is going on here. Herod saw a baby, but he was threatened by the baby. So he saw more than something harmless. Sometimes in looking at the word who became flesh and dwelt among us, some just saw a man from Nazareth, no less, which was not a positive. So it didn't exactly lend credibility to your God resume. Anyway, um, Though sometimes people saw more than just a man. Some, I mean, as the story goes on, who do they say that I am? Some say he's a prophet. Some say he's a miracle worker. Some say you're Elijah. Blah blah blah, on and on. Others thought he was a fraud. The Pharisees, in particular, were trying to prove he was a fraud from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. And when he ends up hanging on a cross, they were going, "We were right. There he is." A fraud. Some would even put him into the category at that point of a victim. But here's the deal, and this is the problem relative to thinking you'd believe. It'd be easier to believe if you saw the very thing that, as a kid, I thought would make it easier to believe, because there he is, and you can see him. For some, it actually made it harder to believe, because now it's almost as if in his visibility, which I would love, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
In his humanity, he became ordinary. That's the ordinary piece. It was in his humanity, in his physical expression, he suddenly became less than this transcendent, faceless, can't even say his name, God. It made it harder to believe, not easier to believe. Isaiah 53 actually confirms this, that his physical expression didn't automatically communicate he was God, because it says this, that Jesus, the one to come, had no stately form or majesty. There was nothing about him that, if he was walking around the neighborhood, you'd go, "Whoa, God." You can kind of tell there's a glow.
Yeah,
on him.
he didn't glow.
No, evidently not. Human, and that's ordinary, and that makes it harder to believe. No stately form or majesty that we should look upon him. He had no special appearance that we should be attracted to him. Not that he was ugly. I remember first, doesn't mean he's ugly, but the point is, there was nothing about him that would draw you to him as if he was God. Like there was some physical expression or something emanating from him. That's why it does drive me a little crazy in movies and depictions, that there is some sort of ethereal, like a glow about him. Yeah. And it's just like, that almost makes the story less effective than tapping into his humanity. So while glory was there, okay, he was fully God, fully man, he was God. I love the way you could say the glory was veiled. We sing a song, I love this song, often at Christmas, veiled in flesh, the Godhead, veiled incarnate deity. So the deity was there, but it was veiled. The Godhead was in him, but it was veiled, it was hidden, and that creates a problem. Because the people to whom Jesus came in the first century had been raised on stories about God that were like rooted in the book of Exodus and Mount Sinai and Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel, fire came from heaven, and at Sinai, the mountain would shake. So when God showed up, in their understanding of God and all the stories they had heard, it was always accompanied with bolts of lightning, the roar of thunder, the flash of fire. But this time, God, apparently, whose name is Jesus, and we're supposed to believe he's God, shows up as a baby. So his voice doesn't blast the treetops, and his anger doesn't shake the ground, and his presence doesn't make you cower, which is nice. But it's also, I'm going, shouldn't I be, this is fascinating theology, shouldn't I be afraid of God? I should be afraid of God, because that's the kind of God God is. She shows up as a baby, and now I'm not cowering. And I like that part, but it's weird, because now this makes it almost harder to believe that he's God when he became ordinary. But in his coming, when you think about the shaking of the trees and the blasting of the fire and the stories that they'd all grown up on, and we have too, it's as if God in Jesus turned down the volume. I love that. Just by becoming Jesus, coming as he turned down the volume, so we could hear without cringing, we could see without squinting and cowering, which is great. But now we see a baby born in a barn, an ordinary person. From, again, the no account town of Nazareth, Joseph and Mary's kid, and we know him. I mean, think about, being the people in the town that where you watch Jesus grow up and your kids went to school with him or something, and great kid. God's a tough sell. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that. The truth is, in fact, we're onto something here because I'm sticking with the text. The neighbors who saw him grow. Do you remember the thing in later on? It says, when he came to his own town, Nazareth, he could not do many miracles because of their what? Unbelief.
Yeah.
They didn't buy it. They weren't buying it. A prophet has no honor in his hometown. How did Jesus know that? Did he read it in a book? Well, he experienced that because we saw the kid grow up. He was ordinary. His own family, some people maybe forget this story, including Mary. At one time, there was this episode in Mark chapter 3 where they came to him and were trying to straighten him out because they thought he'd gone a little crazy. And so it wasn't automatic. The humanness of Jesus, which the ability to see the Word made flesh, we think would make it easier. In some ways, it makes it harder. So if we were there when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, here's a good question. What would we think if we saw? What would we see? Let me ask this question. What would you want to see? Like, what would you want to see that would convince you? The whole thing is, like, I thought that if we could be there, it would be easier to believe. What would make it easier to believe? And I'm just being honest with my own reflection on that question. Well, it wouldn't be a baby. I know we're celebrating that Christmas and everybody, get all sentimental. And we know the baby grows and that's the whole point. But it wouldn't be the baby that I'd be wanting to affirm my faith. And it wouldn't even be the man, Jesus, like, did he have brown hair or whatever? For me, it'd be the miracles.
Yeah.
It would be the walking on the water because that would do it. I would believe and never doubt again if I could see. That's what I want to see. Yeah. Seriously, I mean, how could you ever doubt if you were there and you saw him feed 5,000 or quiet the storm or walk on water or heal the leper or call Lazarus from the dead? I would never doubt again.
Yeah.
I would believe and always believe. And but there's this weird thing, and this is all through the scriptures as well, around the effect that miracles actually have on establishing and creating deep, abiding faith, because miracles don't generally do that. We think they would, but in reality, it didn't. Even Jesus actually was. There's this odd. You have to be in the story long enough to notice it, but there's this odd ambivalence that he even has sometimes to his own miracles. He did them, and sometimes when he did them, he even pointed to them saying, yeah, I want you to notice the miracles in John 10. He says, if you don't believe my words, then believe the miracles, then believe the works you see me do. But the truth is this, for instance, when he did heal people, he didn't heal everybody. Pool of Bethesda is a really good story. Everybody there was sick. He healed one person. And if you're in the crowd, you're going, what about me? And whatever, that kind of stuff kind of gets stirred up. He often downplayed it when he did create a miracle or he did do a miracle, often for odd things. We'd go, why would he do that? I'd want everybody to know, but he'd say, don't tell anybody. Remember?
Right. Yeah.
Don't tell anybody about this. And why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons, and theologians can go off on that. I think that maybe one of the reasons is that I think he kind of knew the superficial effect all through history, all through even biblical history, the superficial effect that miracles had on deep and abiding faith. I mean, think about it. If you're looking for examples of that, I mean, who saw more miracles, the manifested presence of God showing up in tangible ways than the Israelites in the wilderness? Even before that, they were delivered, first of all, from Egypt. Then they come to the Red Sea and the waters part. Manna came from heaven, the pillar of cloud by day, a fire by night. And we know the rest of that story. What all of those positive, I have read those stories as a kid going, how could they not believe then?
Yeah.
Because what it generated, I don't know if it was that generate, but what formed in them, they grumbled and complained. It was never enough. It didn't generate deep abiding faith. It just didn't. The disciples, I mean, think of them. I mean, excuse me, sorry. Who saw more than them? For 3 years, they walked with him. And so they saw the healings, they saw deliverance. They saw him feed the 5,000, walk on water, calm a storm when they were in a boat about to die. In Matthew 17, one of my favorite, Peter, James, and John were on a mountain with him. And the text talks about the veil was pulled back. And they saw the unveiled glory of God. It was the transfiguration, and he transfigured before them. So they saw the glory of God that had been veiled in the flesh. And if I saw that, I'm just telling you, those guys are weaklings. I would believe, I would never doubt again.
Yeah.
You know, right?
I don't think I would ever doubt again, but
I know. Just show me that once. But here's what I'm actually picking on, but I'm actually identifying with them. Because I don't think we're any different than them. We think that would generate faith. It didn't in them. Not long after that transfiguration, actually, it was 2 weeks. All of them deserted him. Peter denied he ever knew him. And you know that whole story. There's a poignant picture in Matthew 23. We talked about it in an earlier episode. Jesus is looking at Jerusalem. It's after triumphant entry, and he's lamenting. He's weeping over Jerusalem. And then he says this. This isn't the thing about that. Even now, you don't know the ways that make for peace. What he says, there was also this: how often I long to gather you, just like a hen would gather her chicks, but you would not. You were unwilling. Stop right there. I'm thinking, yeah, but I'm thinking unwilling. What do you mean what do you mean unwilling? If you're God, be in charge. Be God. What do you mean unwilling? Make them. Oh, they're not doing what I want. Overwhelm them. Make them. It frustrates me. Trying to be in the story. He doesn't make them. He doesn't overwhelm them. He weeps. What's up with that? Well, it's a big part of the story. Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, 19th century guy, wrote this story. It's kind of cheesy, but I love it. It's a little kind of a parable about a king who loved a humble maid. And you kind of know where I'll be going with it. And this king, says Kierkegaard, was like no other king. Every statesman trembled before his power. No one dared breathe a word against him, for he had the strength to crush all opponents. And yet, this mighty king was melted by the love for a humble maiden. Isn't that sweet? Anyway, but how could he declare his love for her? In an odd sort of way, his very kingliness tied his hands. If he brought her to the palace and crowned her head with jewels and clothed her body in royal robes, she would surely not resist. No one dared resist him, but would she love him? She would say she loved him, of course, but would she truly? Or would she live with him in fear, nursing a private grief for the life she had left behind? Would she be happy at his side? How could he know is the big question. If he rode to her forest cottage in his royal carriage with an armed escort waving bright banners, that too would overwhelm her. But he didn't want a cringing subject. He wanted a lover and equal. He wanted her to forget that he was a king and she a humble maiden, and to let shared love cross over the gulf between them. For it is only in love, says Kierkegaard, that the unequal can be made equal. And then he concludes with this: the king, convinced he could not elevate the maiden without crushing her freedom, resolved to himself descent. He clothed himself as a beggar, approached her cottage incognito, with a worn cloak fluttering loosely about him. It was no mere disguise, but a new identity he took on. He renounced the throne to win her hand, and that's God's problem.
Totally.
Because yeah, because our God, I like this line, because our God, whose name is Jesus, desires what power can never win or force. Not subservience. It's not what he wants, but love. I remember doing a series of talks on the wild love of God, and it's a little off-putting because he wants more than a peck on the cheek, and he wants more than a visit on Sunday. He really wants you, kind of thing. But anyway, back to this thing about not forcing and overpowering. So rather than overwhelming or forcing Jerusalem, why don't you just mow him down? Same thing with Rome.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What he chose was the slow, hard way of what we refer to now as incarnation. It's what we celebrate at Christmas. The Word became flesh, incarnated. A conquest from within, not to conquer, but to win, but to do that. And this is where it gets even worse. He not only became ordinary, he became vulnerable. Okay, wait. See, this is like, holy cow. God didn't just become, or he became vulnerable. And that's kind of bizarre. But it's a reality Philip Yancey really taps into well in a book he wrote called Disappointment with God. I really recommend that book, especially if you're struggling with issues of pain and disappointment with God. But here's what he says about this: that those who believe in God can never be sure of him again. For once you have seen God in a stable, you can never be sure where he might appear, or to what lengths he might go, or to what depths of self-humiliation he might descend in his wild pursuit of us. For those who believe in God, it means that God himself is never safe from us. He's not safe from us because he comes to us in such a way that we can always turn him down. And he says this: today, the major events of Jesus' life are marked on calendars around the world. Three basic ones: Christmas, Good Friday, Easter. Of the three, however, the middle one, the crucifixion, took place in the open for the whole world. The whole world, metaphorically, is watching. At the moment when God seemed downright helpless, the cameras of history were rolling, recording it all. Large crowds watched every excruciating detail. And when four men wrote up the accounts of Jesus' life, Peter, James, John, Luke, the spectacle of the cross was front and center. It took up 1/3 of their entire gospel. The spectacle of the cross, the most public event of Jesus' life, reveals the vast difference between a God who proves himself through power and one who proves himself through love. Other gods, still quoting Yancey here, Roman gods, for example, small g gods, enforced worship, like you worship me, or I don't know, die.
Yeah.
Amazing how much worship you get when you do that. You are, I am not worthy. You're right, you're dead. Anyway. Indeed, not bowing to Caesar, many Jews in Jesus' day were slaughtered. But Jesus never forced anyone to believe him or bow to him, doesn't now either. He preferred to act by appeal, drawing people out of themselves and into him. And so it is, says John in John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, but it wasn't always glory people saw. So what do we see? This is question. It's a really good question. Christmas Eve services that everybody's going to go to tomorrow. So what do you see? Oh, it's beautiful. It is beautiful. It's cute. Is what? What do you see? What do you see? Book of Hebrews says this: that God, after he spoke long ago to the prophet, to the fathers, in the prophets, in many portions and in many ways, in these last days, has spoken to us. Literally, the speaking there is revealed himself to us in his son, Jesus. And he, Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory the exact representation of his nature. And he upholds all things by the word of his power. So what do you see?
Mm.
What do you see now? And then if I was preaching this, and when I was preaching this, I said it like this. So what do you see? Well, I see what the angels saw and what the shepherds saw and what the magi saw. The prophets, apostles, the writers of scripture saw. And I don't see it every day.
Mhm.
But they saw the Christ, the anointed one of God, Emmanuel. That's who they saw.
Yeah.
God with us. His name is Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, regarded equality with God a thing not to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave, a bond slave, being found in the appearance of a man. He humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Therefore,
Mm.
God highly exalted him and gave to him the name that is above every name, that at that name of Jesus, every knee should bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. And that's what the angels saw, shepherds saw, magi saw, prophets saw, writers of scripture saw. And that's what you see, and that's what I see, and that's what we hope people see. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. There's nothing more arresting and hope giving than to imagine God in the ordinary. I mean, this message holds so dear to my heart because it is, I feel like my true conversion wasn't as a 5-year-old saying the prayer in bed, but it was God coming to me in some really horrible physical ailments that allowed me to see him coming in these ordinary ways by a meal from a friend and a weird conversation with a kid. I mean, so many ways. It's but yeah, it's both those things. It's arresting and so hope giving.
Yeah, it is. Well, and when you say that, and I mean, you're preaching now, because these little subtle themes, you know, as a little kid, I'm reflecting, honestly, when I was a kid, I thought, if I could have been there, I'd have believed it'd been so easy.
Yeah.
And it's opposite, but when you see the ordinary thing that makes it hard to believe, you start, it opens your mind, it like expands your soul to recognize that that's primarily the way he comes in ordinary ways that we would tend to miss and don't miss it. It hasn't been one of the significant themes we've touched on all through Advent.
Yeah.
We're looking for the big rend the heavens and come down, and he came as a baby. I didn't want that, you know.
That's
right?
not what I was picturing. It reminds me of this conversation I had with Chris, who is your son and my husband. I've never shared this before. Last summer was maybe the worst summer of our life. Horrible. Actually, it was 2 summers ago. Sorry. It was really bad. Okay. My dad had just had his stroke. You had just been diagnosed. Everything was breaking. It was bad. And him and I ended up standing out on our deck. And I probably was just crying and upset about whatever was happening that week. And I looked over to him and I said, I'm just not sure this is all real anymore.
Yeah.
And he looked back at me, a man of very quiet faith. But he looked back at me, and I'll never forget it. He said, this is how we know this is real.
Wow.
I did not like that answer.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. You said that because my son's usually an idiot.
What's that to say about me? I married him.
No, I know. I'm teasing. No, that's great.
It speaks right to this.
Yes, it does.
We take those things that we think might make this absolutely unreal, and it is what makes it so real.
Yep. It's the upside down.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know if there's a story we couldn't find it in. It's
Right.
the upside down reality of God's kingdom.
Yeah.
And it's so encouraging and so confrontational
Yes.
at times. The things we value and like, wow, you missed you miss the things we were demanding,
Yeah.
and he provided it, but it was this way, not that way. And anyway.
I mean, really, we could talk about this all day because it is the gospel message. And yeah, I can't think of anything better to spend our time talking about, but we do have to end this.
Yeah.
In some way, shape, or form. You opened your mouth?
Well, yeah, I'm still wondering about Elizabeth. I know it's after Advent, but it's going to be a whole year before. There's some things about Elizabeth that, well, everybody doesn't know, but this is kind of an experiment for you and me, because I really do want to do some things with Advent and take some of these talks and maybe even write. But Elizabeth is another ordinary person that I think would fit in the self. We'll talk about that later. And if we don't do it, everybody will go, why didn't you do it? And we'll go,
no one will say anything.
Yeah, whatever.
Well, Dave,
Anyway.
Merry Christmas, and friends, keep your eyes open for the wonderful and confrontational and arresting ways that God is coming to you and has come to you in this year. Maybe it's a good time to take a little pause in your life and just remember, look back, because I know I've missed ways that God has come to me this year, and it's good to just stop and see where you may have missed it and allow grace to come, and then feel hope that he is going to continue to come to you, and to find you and to turn our lives upside down. So
Great.
Merry Christmas.
Thanks. We'll start, even if we don't do the Elizabeth, we're starting another series soon.
Yeah,
So
we are.
stay
We'll get
tuned.
right back to it.
Facebookers, stay tuned.